So welcome to our very first KrakCast Profile. It's a new kind of episode we're going to do where we talk about the people and the figures that are in the news that come from different aspects of Polish culture and society, entertainment and politics and sports and lots of other things. And
warning, we may forget to do future episodes. That has happened before.
We've done that once or twice.
We're
going to stick with this one, though.
KrakCast Empty
We
Promises.
used to remove yeah, we did. We're going to come back to that, too. Any other distractions you want to throw out before we
all
get to
those
the
people
point?
we're going to shout out to.
Why do you always call me talking a distraction? Very insulting.
No, we're trying to talk about our KrakCast profiles, and you're already talking about movie reviews. And
Come on, set this up. Set the Donald up, the real Donald T of
all right, so
international politics.
We're going to start profiles with politicians. We're going to do these from time to time in the lead up to the elections later this year in October. We've identified 5 people you really need to know about, big names in the world of Polish politics. We're going to start with probably the only Polish guy you've ever met or heard of named Donald. Of course, Donald Tusk. He's got a very interesting and important career and an important position in Polish politics, even though officially, guys, he's not in Polish politics, is he?
Well, currently he's president of the European Council.
Yes, he succeeded the memorably monikered Herman Van Rompuy.
I like
Best
the fact
name
that you
ever.
have to pause there and think, council, commission, parliament. It's like you never know which one that is.
All right, let's go back to the early days of Donald Tusk.
Well, Donald Tusk, born in Poland, you've got the paperwork in front of you.
57.
So I know he's a spry young man of almost 62.
Mm-hmm.
He's good looking for 61, if I do say so, in a very non-gay way.
He's a
You've got
striking
man
man.
crush. That's cute. You're
Yeah.
into the redheads, huh?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
He's got charisma. I'll give him that.
He's got an interesting ethnic background too for a Pole.
Yes, he's got.
Yes, Mike. What is a Kashubian?
Well, I was about to say he's got German, Polish background, and Kashubian. Kasubi is a region of Poland up north near Gdańsk. But it's also an ethnic linguistic group. It's one of those like how much can you define them compared to other groups? But they do consider themselves a separate identity with a different language. It's actually separate from Polish the same way that Czech or Slovakian is separate from Polish, but it's very close.
And a theoretic region that covers some of Germany, Israel, in this kind of,
In that
ideal land of
northwestern region of Poland, yes. And he identifies with this culture very much so.
it's a huge subpopulation of Poland, one of the only language subpopulations. I was reading there's over 100,000 everyday speakers of the language.
That's a
it's,
lot.
It's basically up there with Śląsk as well, but a lot of people argue that Śląsk is in a separate language, but a dialect, but let's not get into that because that's just even more complicated.
He's also got a strong German element in his background as well.
Yes. His paternal grandfather was German. But the thing is, maternal grandmother was German, but his father was also, grandfather was, on the paternal side, was a citizen of Gdańsk. So after the Third Reich came in, he was actually considered a citizen of the Reich because of this.
So you already have a situation where he kind of sees himself as kind of mixed when it comes to identity. He's not necessarily strictly Polish in the way that maybe most people in the country would identify themselves.
You have to remember that Poland is a very homogenous society, so just being even slightly different is the same as being extremely exotic.
And it's something he talks about a lot himself, that he sees the world through the eyes of, someone who's culturally mixed. It's why he's tied it to his love of the EU many times.
So let's go to what's his point of entry for the world of politics?
He basically, as a student in the early 80s, started his own student solidarity union. This is when you're allowed to have unions that were non-government influence or independent. And he finished college as a Bachelor of History. And after his student ties, he was joined with some other Solidarność groups in the early 80s, as well as some publishing companies.
I saw a quote once where he described his hurly-burly youth as walking the streets, cruising for a bruising. Exact quote. So he was he was a bit of a street fighter in his youth. And I tell you, he looks like he could throw a dig too.
I think so.
Yeah. I think he'd batter Morawiecki anyway. That wouldn't even be a fight.
Hey, you wouldn't hit a guy with glasses. Well, that's how Tusk's political career started. The thing is, in the 80s, compared to a lot of the other anti-establishment, anti-communist movement individuals, he wasn't all that lively. He wasn't being arrested left, right, and center. He wasn't in all these protests or involved with too many of the opposition groups, but he was around.
He worked on a harness cleaning chimneys, industrial chimneys, or painting them or something.
Yes, for a couple of years, he was, a working man, a blue-collar guy. So, he doesn't actually mention that too often, though.
Steeplejack.
And then it says, it seems his political bent was very much liberalism. Friedrich Hayek, he wrote articles. He founded a student newspaper as well, I believe, before he founded his first political party later in the 90s. What was the student newspaper? It was called let's just call it the student newspaper.
Because we're prepared.
Yeah.
And then in the late 80s, early 90s, when things started to transfer, he started being able to hook up with other politicians and got important very quickly. By 91, starting his own, being involved with his own political party. I just don't know how to pronounce what's it called? Koalicja Liberałów Demokratycznych.
Yeah, we'll call it the Liberal Democratic Congress.
Yeah, it's called Liberal Democrats. Liberal Democratic
And he quickly
Congress.
becomes what's known as the Gdansk intelligentsia, like a very important figure on the scene.
Oh, and this is a time, by the way, when there were roughly 100 million political parties founded in Poland at that time, right?
It was basically the era of survival of the fittest. Everybody was starting their own political party. As Solidarność was still a thing, but everybody who had been involved with Solidarność had slightly different ideas. So you had all these different political parties popping up, disappearing, merging, separating. It was a bit of a mess, But most of the politicians we know now came from all those little political parties. They just coalesced into, the slime we know now.
So then he gets elected to the Senate in 97, and then in 2001 he co-founds the Civic Platform, a second political party. And one of the big forces in Polish politics. And, then it was at the presidential election, because I got to Poland in 2005, and I remember Krakow was quickly in mourning when he lost this election to Kaczynski. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes, those were the presidential elections. Actually, I thought it was funny because you have to remember Kaczynski, one of his nicknames because of his surname was Kacor, so duck. So I remember these ads being on TV where
Isn't that too easy, though, Donald Duck?
The docs were easy. It's
too easy.
Duck, Donald, who do you choose? And it turned out to be the advertising for the Donald Duck comic books.
Not clever at all.
Yeah.
At all.
But those elections went on. One of the big controversies there was somebody claimed that his grandfather, we started talking about earlier, born in Gdańsk, actually volunteered for the German Nazi army back in during World War II. It turned out that his father had been forcefully conscripted, which happened a lot.
And spent some time in a camp as well.
He spent time in a concentration camp before being conscripted. So first they point a gun at you and tell you you're spending time in this camp. Then they give you a gun and you're going to go shoot for us. Well, as soon as he was over on the Western Front, he jumped over to the actually Western Polish Independent Army. To help.
Good man.
This is a lot of things that happen. Actually, yeah.
Well, anyway, mine is granddad.
Let me just make a quick point about that, because no matter what happened, and he sounds like he did the right thing, but once he was,
granddad.
But no, it's important because from this time period, from let's say the first 5 years after the end of communism, this was a very, very common kind of dirty trick thing in Polish politics, talking about what someone's grandfather did during the war.
Okay, I get you now.
You collaborate. Your grandpa collaborated with the Germans, collaborated with the Soviets. What kind of, your grandfather was Jewish. There's always a Nazi, Soviet, or Jewish accusation in there that tried to
usually
ruin somebody, or maybe all three.
Regional
exactly.
nuances of.
It's just kind of ridiculous, but very, very common from this time period. Yeah.
So then they win the election, Mikey.
Civic Platform.
There's also one thing we should mention during these elections was the fact he had to pretend him to be a more traditional kind of conservative person. So he actually went back and married his wife in a church because he claimed to be a practicing Catholic, and somebody pulled out but you only had a civil union with your wife 30 years ago.
And am I correct in saying he's always supported the current abortion law, which is restricted to rape, incest, and the death of the mother? He's always supported that staying in place. He's never supported a more liberal version.
He never argued for one or the other. He basically said what's the system we have right now, let's stick with that. I mean, I would think that had to do more with political expediency, that he didn't want to get involved in the debate.
And is it true that when PO was originally formed, they was more of centre-right actually?
They were centre-right, pro-business, neoliberal kind of party. On social issues, they were centre-right as well. Something that's
this ties
really
into some of their identity problems we discussed many times, doesn't it, really?
or lack of identity.
So they get into let's describe the election then. They get a big win in 07. Peace meltdown in government between 05 and 07. They kill each other like a bag of cats and a bag of cats.
I would assume a bag of cats is nothing that you want to stick your arm into. Yeah?
You don't want to put your hand in a bag of cats, no. So tell us.
After they won the elections against Peace, when Peace lost because of the minority government status they had in 2007, they were in power with Donald Tusk as prime minister for 8 years. And this was actually the first time after post-communist Poland that a prime minister was voted back into government.
Because he was leading the country through a global recession with record growth levels. So, he had a lot of credit in the bank for that.
He got a lot of credit, mainly because
the economy's stupid.
Poland was basically defying all predictions about what was going on during the Great
However,
Financial
he
Crisis.
reversed a number of promises, and I want to dwell on the time in government because he also proposed some quite controversial constitutional changes while he was in power. He wasn't quite as pro-business as he promised to be, Michael, was he?
Yes, they actually broke my heart here, because one of the main reasons I voted for them in 2007 was their promises when it comes to tax. They wanted to simplify the tax code, bring down commercial income tax, personal income tax, and other taxes to 15%. This was actually one of those 3 times 15, one of those beautiful political promises. But when they were in power, with influence, so they could have changed tax rates. They definitely didn't lower tax rates down to 15 the way they advertised.
He promised to shrink the bureaucry of the Polish government, and of course it got a lot
Are you
bigger.
saying that the politician didn't tell the truth about what they really... I'm confused, Mike. I'm confused. Wait.
But they didn't even mention we can't do it because of this is this. They just kind of completely forgot about it. And his tax policies, whenever asked about that later, were a lot more progressive, were a lot more squeeze as much money as we can out of the system. I mean, one of the famous things he did during after the Great Financial Crisis was say we need to introduce a higher VAT tax temporarily, so from 22 to 23%.
But still, isn't it fair to say that Donald Tusk presided over a period of remarkable stability, much needed stability after a chaotic era?
Yeah, we give him credit for what he achieved in power. Poland had a massive spurt of growth right through his term as premier, and became a vastly more modern and excellent country to live in. But he did also, there was, it hasn't all been remember all the controversy about the road network leading up to the Euros? That was a real fucking mess. That was. I mean,
they were bringing in millions in investments to build up the roads for the 2012 Euros, and the roads were being constructed, off schedule, poor quality. The money was disappearing, and a lot of people, talk about the government being corrupt. I don't think it was corrupt. I think it was just.
It was a big project, and they failed to, do what they said they would.
So PO loses power in 2014, and Donald Tusk loses his job in 2014.
Well, hold on. Before we get to that, we have to talk about the big row between Kaczynski and Tusk while he was in power. This got really nasty, and the issue of the presidential veto came into play. Now, I mean, just to recap, Polish politics is a slightly weird setup in that the president is supposed to be, I suppose, like the head of state, say, in Ireland, where it's completely notional kind of ceremonial role. But in reality, in Polish politics, that hasn't really played out like that. The president's much more of a, the most national figure. The election for the presidency is always the most attended election. Mike, tell us about the confused nature of the Polish presidency before we go any further, and how this feud erupted, and the consequential legislation I want to talk about as well that Tusk proposed on the back of it.
We have to remember that Poland is a parliamentary democracy, but in most parliamentary democracies, you have a prime minister or a chancellor who is basically the executive branch, the main guy, the head of government, then with a representative in the form of the Queen in the United Kingdom. In Germany, you have the presidency. But in Poland, instead of having a completely premier chancellor-style system, they kind of introduced a few factors of the United States system with a president that has some influence, but not all the way. So what's happened right now is you have veto powers held by the president in a lot of situations. Also, the president is the commander-in-chief, even though that there's a completely different Ministry of Defense headed by the government. Plus also you have a government-led foreign ministry and Minister of Foreign Affairs. But then you have the president being also the head of the government when it comes to representing the country and leading foreign affairs as well. So during the era of Kaczynski and Tusk, so President Kaczynski, Premier Tusk, there were a lot of issues on an international stage where they couldn't agree.
Quick question. Did Tusk ever have a president from the same party during his prime ministership? Or was it always divided?
No, he did after a certain plane crash.
Yeah, Komorowski came in.
Oh, it was Komorowski?
Yeah.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about him. That's right.
2010.
Easily forgotten.
Last 4 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't pop up in the news ever.
So he tried to push through several changes to the Polish constitution, Mike, isn't that correct?
Yes, basically he wanted to limit the president's influence, limit veto powers of the president.
Based off this row, basically.
Yeah, and there was also talk about them getting rid of the Senate, which a lot of people weren't for. So the compromise then was to limit the number of representatives in the Senate. He also wanted to limit the number of representatives in the Sejm. But, as soon as they...
I think that was fair to say. It was pretty outrageous what Kaczynski did. He blocked numerous pieces of legislation, and I don't think that's the form, really, is it? It's not really what the president is there to do. He blocked pension reform. That was very controversial. Agricultural, that went through eventually, though, pension reform, right? They got
yes,
that
it
passed.
did. Yeah. The offer, yeah.
Agricultural and urban zoning plannings, and he wanted to do something with state television as well, and they were all blocked by Kaczynski. So would it be fair to say that was kind of unprecedented in Polish politics, using the veto power like that?
You have to remember that when Wałęsa was president in the early 90s, he also used the veto a lot more than people expected.
That's what I was thinking.
And he set up the precedent and standard, the president set up the precedent, that the veto would actually be used, that it wouldn't just be symbolic, but that it actually be used as a political toy. And in the time of Kwaśniewski, it wasn't used as often or not as loudly or often. So the situation between Kaczynski and Tusk was pretty surprising.
And he also wanted to abolish the Senate, right? But it never really got off the ground.
Well, talk about a power move.
Well, you know what? That goes around.
The plane crashes.
That was
conspiracy.
That was put to a vote recently in Ireland. The Senate survived. But anyway, so now I think we should move into Europe. What do you think? I think we pretty much covered the
PL
main bases.
loses in 2014, but Donald Tusk is not out of a job for long because, Dave...
Because he becomes the president of the European Council, the best paying job in the EU. Thank you very much.
So
he steps off the Polish scene and tap dances into the best job.
What was his qualification for moving into this job?
I'll give you two reasons why they might have chosen him. First of all, they need somebody from the new EU, from the new European countries from the East, and he was a well-known politician. Second, he had a surname that they could pronounce. So,
yes.
Although we always say Tusk, isn't it like Tusk?
It's Tusk, and everybody says a Tusk, but it's close enough. Everybody knows who they're talking about.
Even the simple ones you can't get right. But it's fair to say, that he was seen as the one big bright star in Polish politics. Of course, I really like Donald Tusk's performances in Europe. I think he did his best to stand up to Angela Merkel. I was watching before today. He was the one that was sent out to say, very bravely, in my opinion, because it was not a popular thing to do in his position, was to go out and say, migrants, clear message, stop coming. This is how we have put in place that it won't be happening anymore. He delivered that message. That was a hard message to deliver. He was very vocal and very harsh on Merkel when she made the move unilaterally to, encourage the massive flows we saw across the Mediterranean. And I thought his leadership was always welcome. And he's a straight talker, I know he's made some pronunciations on Brexit that wound a few people up, but, it is what it is. If you can't get a straight opinion from a man, what's the point of him?
What did you make of his English skills when he first took over the office?
Oh, he was actually criticized this for some, but, everybody knew he spoke fluent German, but his French and English, not so much.
His English was very poor.
But he was famous for giving a quote when he received this job that, now I will have to polish my English.
Well,
that was a bad dad joke. Yeah.
Boom.
I was watching him give a lecture at the UCD College in Dublin, buttering up the Irish with all the connections, telling us all about how much he loved us. And let me tell you, there was nothing wrong with his English when he was giving me a little tear in my eye.
Josh, what do you make of
WB8s, apparently.
Speaking of quotes from Tusk, Tusk had a particularly pointed comment for supporters of Brexit, something about a special level of hell.
For the politicians who lied about Brexit.
Oh, yeah.
People who voted for it, John.
Same thing.
No, it was a direct quote. The politicians who...
Yeah, but it was widely interpreted to be... no, it was. It was, if you support Brexit, but that's how it was spun anyway.
Well, to be honest, I can't really be on Donald's back too badly for all of that. I mean, a vote for Brexit is a kind of a thumbs down from those people who voted it for the European Union, who is his employer, and he is a big figure in the European Union. He's hardly likely to come along and say, they got a point. I mean, the EU is a little bit shit,
isn't it? Be quiet on this, maybe kind of diplomatic, in other words.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that functions of apparatchiks in the European Union are broadly defined or not defined at all.
That's what he is, isn't he? Yeah, I think, going back to Dave, I asked you why you think he got the job. I think he got it because he's First of all, he's from the center left. That's why he got the job in the EU. Secondly, he's not strongly nationalist. That's another job he got the EU. And he is a functionary. He's a creature of government. He's been in one government job or another for like 30 years now.
Yeah, next up we got Charles Michel, who was an interim Prime Minister of Belgium. What's your point?
The EU only hires people like themselves, career bureaucrats, career apparatchiks. No, but it's a closed shop. It's a closed shop.
Ideas and some kind of motivation. Yeah. Tusk is like, there's a complete lack of ideology there. It's kind of whatever is politically savvy at that moment, and he's had that throughout his whole career. It's got him in through his whole career. So kudos for that. But he's just so freaking vanilla.
And not to pick on him, he's not the only guy like this. Plenty of career bureaucrats just move up the ladder and finish their career in Brussels. So he's not the first person.
Cards on the table. I like the guy. I'd like to go for a beer with him. He seems like a bit of a
He's extremely likable. No, in that sense, he's got a great political image. Smiles nice. He's friendly.
Look, he's had a good career. He's no big scandals against his name. There were no huge knocks on his time in government. I mean, you can't argue with the growth and performance of Poland.
There are rumors that the door is open for him to maybe make a return to Polish politics.
Well, they do say never try a second act, but that's an American life, wasn't it? So maybe you should give it a bash. I don't know, but it'd be a bold move. I don't believe the Poland seems very favourable. There's a lot of hate for him as well as love. In the country.
He's like Kaczynski. He's a lightning rod for one side or the other.
Yeah.
And so what you think about him kind of places you on the spectrum of Polish politics, just like Kaczynski and Wałęsa and all the rest of them. It's true.
My ma likes him. She's a good judge of character.
Dave, what's your name? Mike.
God, everyone's losing it.
Any chance he's going to come back, or is that just ridiculous to think that he would give up his cushy job in Brussels?
Back to run as president after introducing all these laws and concepts and changes in legislation to weaken the power of the president. So that's unlikely. Will he want to run in like mainstream Polish parliamentary elections as well? I kind of doubt that. He's had a cushy. He could come back here, be a talking head, build up some, statesman-like prestige around him, and, live up to that.
But it's interesting because he's been out of Polish politics for 5 years, but he's still very much an important, influential figure in Polish politics.
I think he's still considered a quote-unquote honorary head of PO, even though he's not like involved with them anymore.
I thought it showed the depth, though, of the amnesty between himself and the right when they tried to block his second term. The only country in the EU, his own country. That must have hurt. I don't care who it came from.
That was pretty harsh, yeah. It's pretty harsh, yeah, for sure. Well, Donald Tusk, everybody, the first in our series of profiles of Polish politicians. Who are we doing next? Who's next up on our list?
Well, we've got a couple of names you want to do, like Kaczynski, Ziobro, Wałęsa. People.
And there was another one, Kaczynski, Ziobro,
Morawiecki.
And Morawiecki, of course. There's your four.
I don't want to mention names because that basically means now we have to.
That's okay. That's the four we were going to do. We'll see who's next. Let's go with Ziobro.
Yeah. You're up next, Big.
The guy's initials are ZZ, by the way.
Yeah, that's kind of cool.
Which is really, it's like a James Bond villain, isn't it?
We'll get to that.
Anyway, for sure. Donald Tusk, everybody. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time on KrakCast Profiles.